Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We are chatting about the PCI 4.0 requirements that became effective on March 31st. So I have some experts with me today that we're going to chat about what you as a PCI relevant company should care about, and specifically around offensive security requirements. Here at Bishop Fox, we do offensive testing, and we've been supporting our customers with their PCI testing requirements for as long as PCI has been in existence. So now that we have a new version that came out last year with requirements that are now in effect, we wanted to refresh for ourselves and the industry what is relevant for any testing and validation requirements. So I'd like to introduce my two members here on our panel, if you will. We have Adam Bush with Schellman and Zack Fasel with Urbane Security. I'd like to have them each just say hello. Adam, go ahead.
Hello there. Yeah, my name's Adam Bush. I sit in the Dallas, Texas office, work for Schellman and Company. I've been with Schellman for about 13 years or so. I'm the managing director of the PCI service line here. So anything related to PCI sort of rolls up through me, for better or worse. So that's PCI DSS, SSF, P2PE, PIN, so all the acronyms.
Awesome. Zack?
And then I'm Zack Fasel. I'm a managing partner out of Urbane Security in Chicago today. And I head up our PCI practice as well, focusing on our high-tech assessments.
With the version 4.0 that came out a year ago, I know there were elements that were effective immediately, and then there's some new requirements that became effective a couple days ago, March 31st. So whether we want to kind of take those separately or all together, just let's talk through what some of those changes are as it relates to offensive security testing and validation.
Yeah, I think some of the ones that have been in effect since the initiation of the standard of 4.0 that took effect pretty much immediately because it wasn't considered really a material change and things that should have been done for a while, but the council considered it as just clarifications. Was with regards to exploitable vulnerabilities needing to be remediated in alignment with their larger vulnerability risk assessment process. Needing to take and classify not just high and criticals, but also lows and mediums for things that are coming from your penetration testing results, and that those need to feed in there. And that will feed into, as we talk about in a second, the future day requirement of actually remediating those lows and mediums. Also, I think some of the things as they clarified very much about for an internal test, what kind of sources need to be considered for it to be a valid internal test. Their applicability notes for internal penetration testing included consideration for both within the CDE, but also coming from trusted and untrusted internal networks as well. I think a lot of problems they had previously with the internal test of some of the vagaries in the definition were over coming just from an untrusted internal source and trying to connect into the cardholder data environments, or coming just from a trusted source and not understanding if there might be another trust relationship that wasn't, called out in the segmentation test. So it kind of gave, a little bit more of a focus and emphasis on the testers having multiple sources for their internal tests. And I think the other big thing that changed for when 4.0 took effect immediately for offensive security was one of the clarifications they added was about some of the things they call significant changes. And it's always been a point of assessor and assessee discussion as to what is a significant change and what do I need to do. If I change a simple upgrade of an application, do I need to do a full pen test of that application if it's a minor version change? Or do I need to do an upgrade if I'm upgrading the OS, or not upgrade, a test if I'm upgrading the OS? And I think a lot of that still depends unique to each environment, but they did elaborate more about what they consider as some additional things for significant into their clarifying stages.
So the evolution or the maturation of the standard is really trying to close those loopholes, try to go back to the original spirit and the intent of the requirement of have this robust vulnerability management program allow you to have some sort of discernment or subjectivity around, does this finding in this test, does it make sense that we, full stop, all hands on deck, we go fix this thing because this is a 0 day, this is exploitable, this compromises data? Or is this something that we can bake into the regular cadence and flow of our vulnerability management program? Yes, we found something, it's informational, maybe it's a low or medium risk, there's some sort of compensating control. We can ingest it into our program and sort of remediate on schedule as we normally would. So with all this added guidance and language around classification and how you go about rating it is still a consistent theme. It gives you a little bit more flexibility, but is also binding you up in a little bit more to hold you accountable to a remediation schedule for the things that were found, and to hold you a little bit more accountable and not allow any sort of declassification of a vulnerability to persist, so that you can, well, even though it's a 0 day and it's highly exploitable, we think this is a low and we're going to patch this next year whenever we get around to it or when it's convenient for us. It doesn't meet the spirit and intent. So some of the rewording and rephrasing that was introduced in a later version of the standard, I think is just trying to add more maturity to that language in the original intent.
Do you think that maturity and that change in language, is it really more helpful for the smaller companies who maybe don't have a robust program of their own and they're really looking for PCI to help them set the standard for their program? Or do you think it's really more helpful for the larger entities that might have multiple compliance frameworks, PCI just being one of many, and they are almost looking, not that these compliance frameworks usually conflict, but they've been looking for this clarification because they're trying to navigate how to balance all these requirements with different frameworks?
Well, I think above all else, I think the council's purpose here is to sort of guide us through establishing a consistent baseline security posture amongst all entities. And that reasonably, if Zack and I both came into the same environment and we evaluated the same thing, we should both sort of reasonably walk away with the same sort of opinion about the posture of that company, whether or not they're following best practices, whether they're in compliance with the standard. So I think this language has got introduced to try to breed more consistency amongst assessors and companies out in the wild as they make these decisions. Whether or not it's a small company problem or a big company problem, I would say yes. I've seen both struggle with it. Mm-hmm. Small companies that sort of have outsourced the entire offensive security and vulnerability scanning components sort of just acquiesce to the judgments of their third-party vendor that's providing the scanning. And they sort of like being able to wipe their hands clean of it and say, we're just going to do what these folks that are specialists in this domain, what their opinion is and how they score and rate all of these findings. Large companies, we see infighting sometimes between the InfoSec group and sort of the product team. The product team just wants availability and uptime and don't make us take this thing offline and patch it because we need to. And the InfoSec's team is saying, no, we have all these obligations. We internally have committed to remediating these findings in 30 days or whatever the period that you've been asked to define is going to be. And so I think the document gives some teeth to that discussion to say, look, we have some flexibility in this range, but the range has now narrowed on us, so we can safely play in this space. And that just helps facilitate that conversation between the InfoSec GRC teams and a product or a solution team who's perhaps trying to pull in the other direction.
Yeah, and one of the things we've seen a lot of is penetration tests come at a reasonable cost. It does cost, depending upon the scope of what you're testing and the number of applications in your environment, a significant portion of what maybe some teams' security budgets. And it's a valid and important component of a vulnerability management program. So I think that's one of the things is a lot of times we've seen in the past with that wiggle room in the definition and the languages that people try to, for the sake of their PCI assessment, keep that testing and that therefore cost of the offensive testing low, since it is a annual or twice annual requirement for some of these tests, and focus their security efforts from an offensive testing perspective in areas that are new and developing and growing that might not be a part of just their cardholder data environment, but their larger information security program. And that's one of the things that we always advise on is, figuring out how you can leverage either your existing testing efforts or security strategy, not just for PCI, but as you leveraging that PCI effort towards your larger InfoSec program. So I think that's one of the biggest clarifications that's helped, and the orgs have seen now, now we actually have to do it, and we can't just cut the corners for our PCI test because we want to focus it elsewhere on our offensive testing.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so for the 4.0 requirements that were future dated, that now are in effect as effect of time of this recording and as we will post this, what's new for that in offensive security?
Yeah, I think there's three of the ones that I always surface is With regards to the vulnerability management, there is a new requirement about remediating all vulnerabilities that are not just critical or high, but also defining that time period for those that are not critical or high and remediating those within those timeframes. And so that's going to be something the assessors are going to start looking at now moving forward, is that those things that are considered low or medium are remediated in alignment with what the policy says is a medium remediation timeframe. For as not just the vulnerability scans, but also the penetration tests, as that requirement does cover that as well. The other thing is with regards to the multi-tenant service provider becoming a definition for a lot of people who were not previously considered what PCI considered a shared hosting provider. For context, PCI previous to 4.0 used the term shared hosting provider. And a lot of people made assumptions based on what that meant as to, a shared compute environment and not just SaaS providers in whole. And so a large number of service providers, when 4.0 came out, fell under this clarified definition of a multi-tenant service provider, which is a definition that a lot of assessors took earlier, but as Adam was saying, was one of those things that some people tried to legalize the way the definitions were and skate around that. And so there's a new requirement for segmentation testing that includes the scope of testing the isolation of customer compartments. Again, a great security thing that should have always been done, but standardizing that within the requirement. One of the other big changes for 401 or 4.0 that takes effect March 31st that we've seen a lot of confusion on was with regards to the requirement now for web application firewall or other dynamic application security for any external facing web applications. Previously, it was optional to have a web application firewall or to have some manual or automated security testing against that external facing web application. And we've seen a lot of questions of, well, now do I have to have a WAF and not do a web application pen test instead? And I think that's one of the big areas that we add the clarification from our side at Urbane, is that it still was required, as the PCI requirements say, that application testing is a part of what's necessary for an external or internal pen test. So as much as the definition in that requirement in requirement 6.4, I think is what it is, one of the sub-requirements there, as much as it's stated that web application pen tests are not sufficient enough by themselves to meet those requirements moving forward, and some application security stack is necessary in a dynamic detection perspective, an application pen test is still going to be necessary on there.
Really good point. So they sort of commingle a lot of the requirements between vulnerability scanning, internal vulnerability scanning, external vulnerability scanning, and penetration testing. They share a lot of the same methodology, and a lot of the same language vocabulary gets used in multiple places. While not strictly offensive security, and vulnerability scanning doesn't meet that need. Zack's point is well stated, that if you are not in compliance with some other requirement, like a password being present or the length or something else, a misconfiguration of something, even though not immediately exploitable, if it's something that is detected on your penetration test that you've misconfigured something, that also could result in a failure, or probably should result in a failure of that penetration test, because you have found something that is directly contradictory to a configuration that is specified or defined somewhere else in the PCI DSS. So it's not just missing patches or sort of privilege escalation findings in a penetration test. It's also sort of identification of a misconfiguration elsewhere that sort of violates a PCI template that should have been applied.
Let's talk about the pen testing methodology. So, we as Bishop Fox always come in with our own methodology, and we've aligned, making sure that it's aligned with the PCI versions over the years, but we also have just our own methodology that we use, right? Hypothetically, if we had a customer who didn't have their own yet, and they're like, well, you guys are the experts, you guys are pen testers, can we just use your methodology? You're telling us it aligns with PCI, you guys use it for other purposes, that sounds good to us. Can a customer or company use their third-party testing methodology and adopt it as their own?
That's always an interesting question we get, and as a large component for the larger testing methodology for an org, it could be leveraged as a component of it. But I think an org still needs to have their own methodology of what needs to be tested, how often does it need to be tested, and at a high level, how does it need to be tested. Those details that might be in your assessing or your testing organization's methodologies that speak to more verbosity as to aligning to different industry standards or different methods of the test actually being performed, that absolutely could be leveraged as relying on the experts as if it was an industry standard. But the organization itself should have something that defines, as I was saying, the cadence, the source locations for the test, the types of testing, and what actually needs to be tested as a part of that versus just we should do a pen test once a year.
Would an example of it on the customer side, the company side, them saying that their methodology is that there has to be manual exploitation and, at a minimum looking for OWASP top 10. Like, if that's what they said for their methodology, is that enough? And then if the testers have something that's more robust, great.
That definitely addresses it for the application testing requirement, but there's a lot more to the penetration testing requirements than just the application testing. So I'm very cautious to say, well, if it's this or this or this, as Adam illustrated before, it's not really that chase to the bare minimum, and we're talking about policy statements. In the larger scheme of things that need to be done for PCI, a policy statement or a methodology should be as easy as updating a document in, Google Docs, Word, or your wiki. So really, that's when we're arguing over the methodology with organizations, I go, really, this is one line that needs to be added, and some more robust policy and procedure, standards in larger organizations. Yeah, it does take a lot to change that, but that is then a team specific or a department specific, methodology. But to bring it all back, yes, I think it's appropriate to leverage your testing org and define your requirements, like you were saying, that they need to meet the OWASP top 10, they need to meet NIST SP 800, or they need to meet, PTES or other standards like that, and then relying on the details of that, of what was actually done, to the testing org. But I do think the orgs need to have their own methodology that at least defines that baseline at a macro level.
All right. Let's see. Is there anything else that you can think of that people might be interested in about either 4.0, 4.01, just the evolution of offensive testing for PCI?
Yeah, I think specific to the offensive security stuff, as Adam iterated earlier and I've reiterated, it's not really a major change in 4.0 for offensive testing, other than as we express some of the vulnerability management stuff. It's just really doubling down and making more clear that this is something that needs to be taken seriously for a PCI assessment. This isn't something that we just check the box by having a penetration test done from one source that we knew they weren't going to find anything because they were put into a jail. There's a lot more of a focus of, you should not be trying to break those rules if you're trying to just check the box for that for offensive security testing. And that's by adding more rigor in the standard, by reiterating the intent in that, and by requiring, further testing through like the segmentation tests that were introduced last time in 3.2.1.
Great. Adam, any final thoughts?
Not a ton to add. Some of the things that have pivoted, that have impacted small merchants, has been pretty eye-opening as of late. I know a lot. For years there was sort of this disconnect between whether small SAQA eligible merchants were going to have to do external scanning, provide ASV reports. There was always sort of at the discretion of the acquiring bank, and it wasn't present in SAQA. They've now got that stuff added. It does seem that the council is sort of turning its gaze more and more toward these small merchants that have outsourced a lot of their payment ecosystem, quite purposefully to gain eligibility for SAQA. What they saw as perhaps that was unintended was that a lot of really large merchants saw the benefits of reducing scope and pursuing eligibility with SAQA and have gone that route. So we're seeing more controls get pushed down that were not present or mandated before for these merchants, or these SAQA eligible merchants. ASV became a formal requirement now that you have to run external vulnerability scans. They sort of had a little bit of a pump fake with 6.4.3 and 11.6.1 around managing scripts on payment pages as that being an attack vector. It wouldn't surprise me if we start seeing a greater encouragement or more guidance that's strongly suggesting more offensive security measures to validate that's what's running on this payment page that's been outsourced or you've outsourced to a third-party provider to manage your iframe. If we see those requirements slowly get introduced or sort of trickle in, and we start expanding scope for what was otherwise or previously an SAQA eligible merchant.
Great, thank you. Interesting. Well, I think I'll wrap that up there and just say thank you to you both. We appreciate what you do for the clients that we work with. As you know, we do our testing work, and you help with the broader compliance work with them. So I appreciate you both spending time with me today, helping us educate all of our customers and people in the industry. So thank you so much.
Christie, thank you for having us.
Thanks, Chrissy. Thanks, Adam.